Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices, focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Today, our speaker is Yevgeny Simkin, who is a technologist and entrepreneur who fled with his family to the United States from the former Soviet Union in 1978 during the mass Soviet Jewish exodus of the 70s. Over the last 25 years, Yevgeny has developed various software products for CBS News, YouTube, USA Today, and many other global media companies. Last year, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Yevgeny co-founded Samizdat Online, an anti-censorship media platform that uses a unique internet protocol to make it possible to bypass internet blocking commonly practiced by autocratic regimes such as Putin's. Over to you, Mr. Simkin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Durbach, and thank you to the World Information Transfer Board of Directors and the Ultra Institute for inviting me to present Samizdat Online and talk about what we've built and where we're going, and help let the world know what mechanisms and opportunities exist to counteract the kinds of things that people like Vladimir Putin are doing in the world. I have some time to speak, so I'm going to delve into first principles. When I have very short amounts of time, I just dig right into what we're doing. But because I have a little bit of space, I would like to examine what the actual problem space is. It's a little bit philosophical, because then it makes it more understandable why we chose to build our product the way we did and what our strategy is. So the World Information Transfer Organization, it's fascinating to have the word information in the name of your organization, because information is, in fact, at the heart of what separates humans from all the other creatures on this planet. I'm an atheist, so of course I begin all of these conversations with references to the Bible. In Genesis, Eve and Adam take bites of the fruit of knowledge, which everyone mischaracterizes as an apple, but of course it was not an apple, it was a banana. No, it was the fruit of knowledge, which means that at the moment that we bit into this notion, the notion of being able to have understanding, right? Because what is knowledge if it's not understanding? We became incompatible with the Garden of Eden and the kind of blissful ignorance that all the other creatures on earth live with. People misinterpret, I think, this as a punishment, that the God of the Bible punished Adam and Eve and expelled them. But I interpret it as a much more organic, inevitable consequence of our becoming familiar with reality and becoming familiar with our own mortality. And that is indeed how I interpret the notion of us dying as a consequence of participating in the consumption of the fruit of knowledge, is that we were always mortal, but we had no idea about it. And the transition into that understanding is what makes us susceptible to death. So that is an idea to keep in mind as I move forward. Vladimir Zelensky, when he was presenting to Congress last December in 22, he said a phrase that I literally jumped out of my seat when I heard him say it, because I felt like whatever else he said, this phrase was the most consequential and relevant in his presentation. He said, "The Russians will stand a chance to be free only when they defeat the Kremlin in their minds." So this is fundamentally true. I'm completely convinced that the difference, the thing that separates people who act with benevolence and kindness and compassion and thoughtfulness, and people who act with cruelty and let's just call it evil, is in fact bad information. If you compare the Germans who lived in Germany in 1939 and who were thoroughly in favor of mass murder and invasion of their neighboring countries, and the Germans who live in Berlin today. I was just in Berlin last week. I was invited by the German Council of Foreign Relations to talk about Samizdat Online. I met some incredible people who are all engaged in the work of trying to help ameliorate the situation in Ukraine, help the Ukrainians, and trying to figure out how to get the Russians to understand what is actually being done on their behalf and in their name, because they are thoroughly confused. So those Berliners that I met last week did not seem particularly enraged about the fact that I'm of Jewish ethnicity. They were not looking to murder me, and they were not overly interested in invading their neighboring Poland. Something happened in the last 70 years that has moved them from feeling one way to feeling another. And obviously it's not genetic. So what's the delta between what modern Germans are experiencing and what the Germans of World War II were experiencing? It's information. There's no other explainer for it. The ability for a demagogue or a group of demagogues to take control of the media sphere and to extricate reality and to fill the vacuum with lies, whatever it is that they happen to be lying about, in a compelling and engaging and acceptable way. So modern day Russians, as much as they are now reviled by the world, and as much as they do now have to accept on their conscience the actions of their nation, actions that they will have to be remedying and making amends for probably decades. But genetically, these are the same Russians that existed during World War II, who fought the Germans and helped win that war, much to their credit. And I'm, again, convinced that the difference between these peoples is not genetic, it is information. And so our question is, what do we do to help get the right information to that populace? Because as much as all the efforts to combat them on the battlefield are entirely worthwhile, entirely justified, and essential, there is an equally essential project of deprogramming all of these people who are convinced of the most egregious nonsense. Nonsense that doesn't even square with their own understanding of reality, right? For example, Putin has filled their minds with ideas such as that the Ukrainians are now largely a nation of Nazis of some flavor, who are being controlled by NATO and by Biden and whatever, and these Nazis have elected a Jewish president, right? Consider the absurdity there, that these are Nazis who have elected a Jewish president, and this Jewish president is somehow helming the slow corruption of Russian minds and whatever else. I mean, it's just, it's an absurdity so profoundly silly that if somebody were to write it into fiction, people would reject that fiction as being absurd. It's not, no one would buy such a fiction. Nothing like this could possibly happen. And yet here we are, and it is happening. And that is a testament to the power of the propaganda machinery inside of Putin's Russia. This is a propaganda machinery that would make Joseph Goebbels blush and with envy. Of course, Goebbels didn't have access to the kind of technology that Putin has. There's a formidable assistant to the propaganda, which is the nature of our modern social media and other mechanisms that have come to be in the last 25 years. Some of this technology is intentionally being put to use. Other technology is unintentionally being put to use. So for example, when I was at the DGAP last week, I found out that Google is playing a major role in the distribution of Putin's propaganda in Russia. I presume inadvertently. I don't think that Google's operators and leaders have the desire to promulgate Putin's lies. But in fact, a product called Google Discover, which is on all Android phones, is responsible for the distribution of roughly 20 million clicks per day to various propaganda outlets that continue to befuddle and confuse and further the Russians' misunderstanding of what is going on. My product, Samizdat Online, which was built precisely to do the opposite, we are scrambling to reach any audience at all. Meanwhile, Google is actively working against us. Again, not intentionally, but this is the nature of the reality that we have today. So it's really important to understand how propaganda works in Russia, because in order to understand how we can counteract it, we first have to really truly delve into what is it that it's doing. Many people misunderstand the nature of Putin's propaganda to be something very Orwellian, or something that they read in 1984, where people turn on their TV and they see some military man covered in various metals, just spewing endless propaganda with an angry face. That's not the nature of the propaganda at all. The nature of the propaganda is that Channel 1, which is the principal TV channel in Russia, has tons of very, very high quality entertainment. None of it is political, or most of it is not political. It's sports, it's soap operas, it's game shows, it's music, it's all sorts of stuff that people flock to because it's well produced and it's well made. And then in between all of that, there are short newsreels that plant certain ideas in people's minds. And those newsreels obviously are full of lies, but of course, with good propaganda always has seeds of truth in it. So you can take those seeds of truth and then you can genetically alter them to be in any plant that you wish to grow out of those seeds. And so over 2 decades of this kind of propotainment, the population has become completely confused. They have no idea what is actually going on. So that's the nature of the problem space. So what's the solution? Well, I'll come back to that in a second. But first, I have to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I took up this mantle. My father was a professor of psychiatry in Soviet Russia. And at some point when I was about 2 or 3, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which came out of nowhere. He was not surrounded by any people who could have given it to him. He was a professor at a major medical institution. He had access to all of the most modern medical equipment and medical expertise. And his colleagues told him that while they can keep his tuberculosis at bay and it won't expand, he will never get rid of it. It's there, that he has it for the rest of his life. He was not satisfied with this answer. And he went looking for some alternative. And what he found was yoga. And that's interesting in and of itself. But what's more interesting, or what stuck with me, was that he found it in Samizdat, right? Samizdat was a clandestine mechanism, an agreed upon grassroots activist behavior where people would smuggle illicit, banned, censored content into Russia one way or another. That content was not always news. In my father's case, it was instructions on how to do yoga, but it was frequently music, literature, just everything. Everything was censored. Everything was banned in Soviet Russia. So Samizdat, which literally translates to self-publication, was an organized grassroots movement where people would smuggle content in, and then there was an agreement that everybody who got a piece of this content, they would personally make 2 more copies by hand. and distribute those 2 copies to their friends or relatives or whoever else was interested. And then those people would make 2 more copies each, and so on and so forth. This was viral social media 1960s style. So my father found yoga in Samizdat, and he then found himself an instructor. And over the course of the next 2 years, he cured himself of tuberculosis. I can attest to the fact that the tuberculosis was gone because when we were entering the States, he underwent a medical examination, as all immigrants had to, and he was not, they did not find anything in his lungs that was alarming. And so he did, in fact, get rid of tuberculosis. I'm not advertising yoga, although I think it's a fine and lovely practice. But what I am advertising is the power of the distribution of information by people who want that information. Or more importantly, people who understand that the people around them need that information. So you have a situation in which people who are living in a country and they understand that they're surrounded by a population that is ignorant of reality, of all reality. And they take it upon themselves to try and help inform that population as to what is actually going on. So that's the ethos of Samizdat. It's a Russian word. It's also a Ukrainian word. I was told last weekend that Ukrainians will be repelled by the fact that it's a Russian word. I, of course, understand that people who are in Ukraine now, or people who fled from Ukraine, have a very strong aversion to Russian everything at this moment. I certainly do not judge them for that. But Samizdat is both a Russian and a Ukrainian word, and it means the same thing in both languages. 20 some odd years later, I wound up hiring a bunch of Russian-speaking engineers for my enterprise, which is called A-Flat-Minor, and it's a software engineering firm. And we were building stuff for all sorts of brands, doing some great work. The Russian-speaking engineers were somewhere out east. At the time, I could not even tell you where they were, even though I spoke to them every day. It didn't matter. We were online. And everything was going great. And then on February 24th of last year, everything came to a grinding halt when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I had to immediately find out where my engineers are and how can I help them. It turned out that about half of them were in Russia and about half of them were in Ukraine. There was very little I could do for either side, really. We offered what we could. I offered a couple of my Ukrainian engineers to take their families to Canada, where I currently live. I offered the Russian guys to move them into Georgia or Turkey. And a couple did accept. And beyond that, there was very little I could do. So I had this question going through my mind: what else can I do? Right? There was a moment where I thought maybe I should go and pick up a machine gun and help the Ukrainians fight off the Russians. But I know very little about operating a machine gun, and I'm now in my 50s. So, you know, in spite of my very youthful appearance, I would probably make a reasonably terrible combat operative. So I was really trying to figure out what the nature of the problem space is and what I can do to help. And actually, very quickly, it came to me that I exist at this very strange nexus where, because of my abilities as a programmer and because of my know-how with media and the internet, and because of my various connections to the world of journalism, and indeed, I had been writing some articles for The Bulwark for the last several years. And so I was in touch with Bill Crystal and we'd become very friendly. So suddenly I was in this very interesting intersection of spaces where I knew what I wanted to do technologically. And also I had the attention of certain people who could potentially get this thing out into the world and help us promote it and help us distribute it. So specifically what I realized was that we need to undermine Putin's propaganda, right? And that undermining consists of two, well, I mean, there's nothing we can do to stop his propaganda. His propaganda will continue unabated until he is gone. But we can undermine his ability to protect his population from reality. We can undermine his ability to stop information from entering his nation. And at the same time, I was thinking about what technologies already exist in this space. And most people were talking about how, well, there's VPN, right? Virtual private networks. VPN is a wonderful technology, but it's an intentional technology. The person using the VPN needs to know that they want to use it. They need to find it. They need to sometimes buy it. They need to install it. And then they need to reinstall it when the authorities come and find the VPN that they're using and block it, because VPN is also blockable. So that's a problem, because the people who we need to mobilize to distribute information, they are the ones who know how to use VPN, but they are a small minority. The vast majority of the people don't even realize that there's something to be found. And so if you reach out to them and say, hey, if you could just install this VPN, I can send you some links or something like that, they're never going to do it. That's not how this works. The key to this is to reduce all the friction and to be able to just hand them something that they can look at. Now, again, in the 60s and 70s, that was literally a pamphlet or an audio tape or a book. But today it's the internet. So how do you deliver something on the internet to someone in a way where they can simply click on it and take a look? Well, that's what we built. Me and my co-founder technologically, Michael Sprague, I came to him. He and I have been colleagues for 20 some odd years and friends for exactly as long. And I said, Michael, I have this idea and I want to build this and I know exactly how to build it. And Michael said, I actually have it mostly built already because that's the kind of person Michael Sprague is. So we were able to launch the core of the functionality for this within about 2 weeks of my having this thought. And again, the nature of the product is that it makes it possible to get the content, create a link to it that is unblockable or essentially unblockable, and distribute it into the zone that is trying to block it and send it to those people who do not know that they need it. Right now, I'm not naive and I'm not suggesting that the moment somebody who is enamored of Putin's propaganda and has been living in it for 20 some odd years sees a link to some information, their eyes will burst wide open and they'll change their minds about everything in their lives. That's not the way any of this works. But you have to start somewhere, and introducing some kind of doubt about the world that they live in is essential. And that doubt will snowball and grow into something, eventually a movement of some kind, as it did during Soviet times. Samizdat of the Soviet era was in large part responsible for the Russian population's ability to understand what was actually happening in the world. So I named this product after that product. I updated the name to Online so that we can bring it into the 90s out of the 70s. The name is not consequential. I've heard some pushback from various people who say, well, this name is too arcane or too difficult or too Russian or whatever. It doesn't matter. The name is completely irrelevant. The platform itself is built as a content platform as a service. That's a modern term. We can build anything on top of it. We can launch any kind of product on top of it. It can have video and podcasting. It could be named anything at all. So the media enterprise that we've built is called Samizdat Online, but the underlying IP is open for licensing, and anybody who wants to launch a product that bypasses autocratic censorship. And of course, this is in no way limited to Russia, right? Any place on earth that has an internet connection, this will work. And we're already live in Belarus and in Iran. And of course, the ultimate goal is China. But for that, we will need substantially more funding and help. But the point is that the underlying architecture is perfect for any undermining of autocratic censorship. And indeed, if this thing catches on, then the era of autocrats being able to prevent their citizens from seeing what's out there is behind us. So in a way, this is a watershed moment potentially if we get the right kind of attention and the right kind of help. So we're coming up on a half hour, and I feel like I have about 7 or so minutes left, and I wanted to demonstrate how it looks and how it works, and also have a couple of more words about the people involved, because they are we have a fantastic team. It's a small but incredibly effective team. So let me quickly demonstrate what Samizdat Online looks like. So this is our front page, and what we do is Anna Trubacheva, who is our executive editor, and she is a prominent journalist who spent many years in the Belarusian journalistic milieu, and then had to flee, and now she lives in New York, and she's on our team. And she and a couple of other editors on our team go through the various publications that we are carrying. We currently have about 75 publications. 59 of them are exposed with their front pages. I'll explain that in a second. But they go through all of these publications. They find the stories that are the most interesting to their mind. And then they translate the headlines into the 5 languages that we currently cover. So you will notice that we have Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, Farsi, and English. So I'm looking at the English version and I'm demonstrating the English version. But all of these stories, the headlines are translated into these 5 languages, irrespective of what the subject matter is. So even though these stories up here are they're from Ukrainian Pravda, and this one's about Zelensky, this one's about the dam that was blown up yesterday. But if you switch to Farsi, you will notice that it's all the same stories, only now in Farsi. Now, obviously, if I scroll down further, we will find stories about Iran, and those will also be in Farsi. But the objective here is to show everyone everything and kind of give the whole world visibility onto what's going on. So this link from Ukrainian Pravda, you will notice down in the lower left-hand corner, if I move the mouse, it will disappear, but you'll see that there's this link to IBZXMYEZTP, right? So that's the domain where what we're about to see is located on. When I click this, it will jump to this link. And here's the original content from Ukrainian Pravda. It's in Ukrainian, we're not translating it. Obviously, anyone can use Google Translate if they wish to translate the content for themselves. But this is the link that would be sent to somebody, right? And it's interesting, I've had some pushback from Ukrainians who say things like, well, we don't care what the Russians are reading, we just want to kill them. Again, I totally sympathize and understand with that sentiment. But as it turns out, the entire eastern region of Ukraine, right, the Donetsk, Donbass, Crimea, these are all, their internet is currently routed through Moscow. So people living there also cannot read this without some kind of countermeasures, either through us or through VPN or some other mechanism. So I would encourage my Ukrainian friends to be more enthusiastic about putting as much of the Ukrainian media into our platform, having them collaborate with us. Because even if you don't care about changing the Russians' minds, it's still pivotal for the people living in Ukraine to have access to this content. So once they reach this page, they can read the article. Our technology actually transfers all the links in the page through it. It does this kind of obfuscation to them as well, so they can continue their journey, or they can share this page through these, completely standard sharing mechanisms such as WhatsApp or just email or Telegram or Vkontakte or whatever sharing mechanism they're used to. They can share these links with their friends and family, and those people will see those links open for them like this and be able to read this news and share it on and on, which is the objective. And then here we have the entire list of publishers. So other than the stories, the individual stories that I showed in the main page, we just have the primary publishers. So if you come here and you're interested in reading Medusa, you click on the Medusa page and it opens up and there's Medusa for you. Now, of course, this is a little bit more risky to share because sharing Medusa in Russia, it may actually exposes you to risk of imprisonment. But we do what we can to strip out all the cookies and all of the JavaScripts and everything else that could potentially track you. So I'm now looking at this in an incognito browser. And when I close this browser, it'll vanish. And so if you're a citizen living in a nation where you might be watched by the authorities, this is a almost risk-free way to read this content. And these people would have to decide for themselves how they choose to share it. And we have a whole project in the works of advising people of what their best options for sharing are, what is the most safe practice, and so on and so forth, because we certainly don't want to expose anybody to any undue risk. The way that we got in touch with Medusa, so I have to mention Stas Kutcher, who is our chief content officer. Stas is a very, very prominent Russian language journalist who lived and worked in Russian journalism for decades. He was the biggest Putin critic for basically since the early 2000s. And he, when he joined our team, when he found out what we were doing, he was very enthusiastic about it. And he opened up all the doors because he knows everybody in the Russian journalistic space, the people who are now opposing Putin. He introduced us to the people at Doors and Echo and Medusa and everybody else. And Stas plays a major role in all of our, in the way that we're developing this product, because the future of this product, again, circling back to what is effective when combating propaganda, the way to effectively combat propaganda is to, again, engage people with something more than just news. And through Stas, we have access to all sorts of performers, comedians, singers, people who are opposed to Putin's agenda, and we can provide a space for them to prosper and to service their fans with their talent. But also it will wind up bringing everyone together. It will wind up being an appealing space for people to come and see what's happening. And subsequently, we will give them their vegetables and their vitamins while they're at it. So this will provide a truly engaging platform that will hopefully entice people to gather and then to see what's going on and then to share it with their friends and family. And of course, the most powerful group that we're looking to mobilize is the diaspora. There are millions upon millions of Russians and Iranians and Belarusians and Chinese living outside of those nations who have direct contact with people back in those nations. They're in touch with them basically on a daily basis. And they have access to US dollars or dollars, so they can be monetized, and this product can be a financial success because it needs to be in order to survive. But the point is that the notion that there's people in the West and people in these nations and nothing in between is incorrect. Like that we have this incredibly motivated and ready to roll millions strong audience that they're all asking themselves, how can I help, right? Well, this is the answer. This is how you can help. We just need to get this content to them and then they can take it from there. So I think on that note, I will wrap it up. And
thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Simkin. That was a fascinating presentation, and understanding information is unique to human beings. That's why I started, and it's called World Information Transfer. But let's continue on. We have many, many questions. So we'll continue on to our moderator, Susie Hallen. Over to you, Susie.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach. We have many questions from the audience. The first is, what can be done to protect journalists who are doing the work to bring awareness to issues like the war in Ukraine?
It's a fantastic question. And in fact, we are developing a mechanism that will allow journalists, and actually anybody, to use our platform on the web without any app, without anything, to record video or take photographs or do anything in real time with their phone and upload it to our system, where it winds up being sort of a Shutterstock kind of repository of content that is anonymously delivered. So there's absolutely no risk to the person who is shooting it and sending it. I mean, I'm not sure if the question is more broadly about journalists writ large who are already living in these areas and are already subject to various risk. We can do what we can to try to minimize the risk when people are consuming this content, and to the extent to which we can minimize the risk when they are uploading this content, that's what we're doing. If you're already a known journalist, you know, I mean, if you're already operating in a space where you're in danger, I don't know what we can do to help necessarily, other than to help anonymize your reporting, which is something that we are working on. But But if you're already being followed, if you're already watched, then you're kind of living by your own wits, and I really applaud those people and tip my hat to them.
Agreed, it's very brave. Next question is, how do you convince yourself to pursue journalism and the truth when you know the dangers that can occur for journalists?
Journalism in general is the most essential aspect to a free society, right? So if you're asking yourself what's important to a society, well, maybe democracy, maybe freedom of expression, perhaps, but I'm not dismissing those; they are critical. But the ability for the population to know what their leaders are up to, and for a free and open free press to operate unrestricted, without fear, without danger of being thrown in prison or murdered, as they are in Russia and elsewhere, that is fundamentally essential, because the moment that the government is able to operate in any kind of obscurity or in any kind of lack of transparency, inevitably their corruption takes hold and they are doing all sorts of malignant things. So in terms of how do you convince yourself? Well, it's literally the most noble thing you can do. So if you have the desire to do something noble, and yes, it's brave, and yes, it's dangerous, but it's essential. And maybe in places like the United States, it is less dangerous, and at this point, maybe painful in the way in which that the ad revenue model has really corrupted the entire industry in a way that is highly troubling. But if you go to Rwanda, or if you go to Belarus, you're in danger, and you're doing something that is truly noble. So I think that for the right kind of people, this is a natural calling, and it's definitely not for everyone, because it is very much like picking up a gun and going to the front, where you could lose your life or limbs at any moment.
Thank you. Having read your article about why Ukraine is dangerous to Putin, is there hope for people in autocracies like Russia to choose another path in the future?
It's not just hope, it's essential. So the irony is that Putin is presenting a new kind of human global organizational structure, whereas Russia before was an advocate of communism, and people suffered under communism. I remember that personally. Now Putin's sales pitch is, all right, communism's bad, how about corruption, right? Corruption sounds like it should work, where the people who are in, they get what they need, there's no hassle, you don't have to stand in line at the DMV, you pay your taxes when you feel like it and to the amount to which you feel you should be indebted, etc. And this, on its face, to some people sounds very appealing, but the proof is in the pudding. Russia has been living in this corrupted, by understandings, that's the term for it in Russian, organization for 20 years, and things are completely collapsing. Like it doesn't work. So will the Russian public eventually come around to recognizing what is happening? They will, because their lifestyle and their ability to live a comfortable, normal life will be so depressed. And their neighbors immediately to their west are going to be experiencing this incredible renaissance and this phoenix from the ashes existence. And I can tell you anecdotally that there are already stories of Russian soldiers who, even now in Ukraine, right? Like Ukraine is not a bastion of prosperity yet, but it was on its way. And they are, stealing washing machines because they can't believe the level of luxury and opulence, quote unquote, that the Ukrainians are now living under. So at some point, reality takes hold, and people in a situation like that, they've had enough, and they see very little to lose, and they realize that blaming Biden and NATO and America and the West writ large, that's all very hard. Those entities are very far away. But Putin or their leadership or their local governor, they're right there. So it's much easier to go knocking on their door and saying, why the hell am I living in squalor when everyone else seems to be doing quite nicely? I thought we sold them billions upon billions of dollars of oil and gas. Where's any, like, why am I not seeing any of this bounty? I mean, that's what percolates through their minds eventually, but it does have to get substantially worse for them before that actually happens.
Why do you think that people still believe in Russian propaganda and continue to spread Putin's false statements, even with the increased access to global news and information around the world?
Well, that's an incredibly difficult question to answer. And also, we need to pick apart what we mean by people, right? So very quickly, the people in Russia, they believe it because it's basically all they have access to. And yes, they have, with some amount of effort, they could reach reality. They could find it on YouTube. They can install VPNs. If they knew about us, they could use us. But most people are just subsumed by the fire hose of lies that they are being told. But I already said all that, so I won't repeat it. In the West, I think that there are people who love conspiracy theories and people who love thinking that they understand something that the rest of us sheep don't get. And so once they get their hands onto a narrative that is that makes them feel particularly clever, they will stick with it, all evidence to the contrary. And interestingly, I've read articles from respectable, seemingly reputable sources who also manage to twist themselves into knots and somehow justify Putin's actions. If not justify, then at least find some kind of rationale for how it's not all his fault, right? But I mean, anybody who looks at the facts in an unbiased way realizes that it is in fact all his fault. But it's not that hard to find the tendrils of evidence that can lay blame elsewhere and then follow those down however many rabbit holes, sorry to mix my metaphors, into all sorts of maligned nonsense. And obviously that is in no way limited to the Ukraine story, right? I mean, I have a friend who believes the earth is flat, and he's my friend and he's a good guy, but he believes the earth is flat. So this is just the nature of the world in which we live right now.
Makes sense. Could you please summarize the main methods of manipulation used by media in countries under dictator rule to achieve such public trust?
The nature of how they manipulate the media, or the nature of how they suppress the content? You know what? I feel like I've said quite a bit about how they manipulate the media. I will repeat it briefly. They take control of the entire media space. They shut down anything that doesn't comport with their particular narrative. They pump that narrative full of very enticing and entertaining and non-news related content that is appealing to the masses and brings people like bees to flowers. And then once they're there, they get little doses of lies, which build up over time and which set up a whole narrative over time. And then the people living in those nations are then subsumed and hypnotized by that egregious malformation of reality. But from a technological standpoint, it's an interesting thing to address as well, which is that because in these nations, the leaders have access to the way that the internet is actually developed and structured, the actual infrastructure, they can very easily manipulate the internet in such a way as to make it impossible to reach, or extremely difficult to reach, that content which they don't wish for people to see. And that's what happens, where they just eliminate all of the media that they feel is going to contradict them or in some way undermine their objectives. So in Russia, for example, there's actually a very interesting decision-making process as to what they disable and what they leave operational. So for example, they disabled Twitter, they disabled Facebook, they disabled Instagram, they disabled chess.com, right? Because it was a platform where people played chess and talked politics, apparently. So that's dead. But they left YouTube available, even though YouTube has tons of information that contradicts Putin's propaganda. And there's lots of speculation as to why. One of the theories is that YouTube is a very powerful platform that the Russians use for all sorts of entertainment, and that if they were to kill it, the backlash would be pretty sizable. And that, like, there's there's this unspoken compact between the Russian government and the people. And the compact says that the government will rob them blind, but will leave them with these minor conveniences and not ask them to sacrifice anything at all, other than the ability to live a modern Western life. But that notwithstanding, the government will not ask them to pay any taxes or do anything, right? They will just provide them with these minor conveniences. And in exchange, the government can do whatever it wants, and the people basically don't, they turn a blind eye, and that's the end of that. So killing YouTube would be a major violation of that unspoken compact. It could still happen at any time. There's constantly rumors that I catch through the media rumor mill that they are finally decided it's okay, there's just too much reality. I mean, for example, there's TV Rain Doors, which has millions upon millions of viewers, and they continue to broadcast. They're living in exile. They're now in, I believe they're in Holland, and they continue to broadcast reality. And this obviously hurts Putin's propaganda machinery. But on the other hand, my understanding is that the most viewed video in Russia is Baby Shark, right? So apparently Russian parents just need that content to get their kids out of their hair. And if you were to undermine Russian parents' ability to help pacify their offspring, that could be a step in the wrong direction, politically speaking. So it's that kind of that's the calculus that apparently they're working with.
What do you think about like the US media? Do you think that maybe not to the same large scale we've been discussing in other countries, but do you think that the media is kind of manipulated here as well?
Well, of course, the media is manipulated. It's manipulated everywhere, but it's incredibly important to understand the distinction, right? The media in America is not manipulated by the government. The government has some minor here and there influence where they poke their finger into something. Like if you follow the whole Twitter I'm going to call it a debacle, in fact, but it wasn't a debacle. Actually, it turned out that really nothing happened there. The State Department kind of asked Twitter to maybe sort of kind of do something. Twitter had every right to say, no, we're not going to. And in fact, on multiple occasions did, and suffered no consequences as a result. Nobody was thrown in prison. Twitter's servers were not throttled, and their content did not suddenly flow at 1/100th the rate that everything else did, as happens in autocratic regimes. So the Western press and the Western media has a completely different problem. And it's a real problem. And that problem is one of incentives, where they're incentivized purely by income. And there is a very real maligning and skewing of the kind of content that they're going to focus on, because it's what they believe will make them the most money. So that is definitely a problem. But it's a different problem. And it's important to not conflate the two problems. And it's important to understand that Americans generally have access to everything they need and want. And I'm using Americans just writ large, the West, right? The places where the press operates freely. Let's include Sweden in that. So the West has a press that is in fact free and is only in some way stifled by its very unfortunate incentive structure as it exists right now. Places like China and Belarus, where if you're a reporter, if you say anything that that runs afoul of the official narrative, it will land you in prison. And frequently you're put in prison for things that you said 5 years ago, which were acceptable to be said then. And now things have changed, and retroactively you're put in prison for having said the wrong thing then. I mean, it's just that it's a completely different problem. It's not, they need to be spoken about separately.
Makes sense. What IT and new media innovations can be used to effectively counter Putin's censorship and support freedom of speech in Russia?
Hey, how about Samizdat Online? That was the whole reason for the last 53 minutes. So there are numerous technologies that are being developed. Ours is just one. Really, this entire system needs to be utilized in unison, in concert, in conjunction. Everybody needs to be working together. If the question is which specific technologies, if you email me, I'm happy to send you a list of the various technologies that are out there. The vast majority of them are in fact VPNs of different flavors. And what we have invented is substantially different architecturally from VPN. And I'm really hopeful that people will start taking advantage of it and tell everybody about it. And in fact, if there are media enterprises that wish to spin up their own versions of what we're doing and build their content on top of our underlying tech, which makes it possible to send their content anywhere on Earth, please come to us. We're ready.
Very cool, thank you. Why is Russian propaganda so successful, and who does it target more, its own citizens or foreigners outside the US or outside Russia?
It is successful because there is a pyramid structure to the way that information is distributed. And the government has the ability to completely isolate the population, and they have the time to do it because, as I said, this has all been happening for 20 years. So a slow trickle of lies across all your media spheres and gradually the complete extrication and shutting down of any voices or narratives that contradict what you're saying, and taking control of all the technology that makes it possible for people to reach that content, and then subsequently starting to use brute force with killing journalists and putting people who distribute this content in jail. Very quickly, the people understand what the stakes are for going against Putin's will. And they live it, I think, I mean, this is me taking a stab at a geopolitical thesis. They live at a place in their lives, comfort-wise, where things aren't bad enough. They're pretty bad. They're bad enough that they don't want to, they don't want to make it worse, and they're just going to kind of huddle and live in whatever misery they have. But they haven't reached that place where everyone's just grabbing pitchforks and they've got literally nothing left to lose, and they're heading to the Kremlin to battle with the crowd suppressing thugs of the police force. I suspect we'll get there, and I'm suspecting we'll actually get there reasonably soon. But that's I think that's the answer to that question.
Thank you for the response. And it ties a bit into another audience member's question, which was what could be the potential risks and political consequences involved with undermining Putin's censorship system. So I think you've touched on a few of these already, but anything to add?
Yeah, the risks are, for the people who are engaged in the counter narrative, the risks at the moment is that they're going to be put in prison. Yes, our technology tries to de-risk as much as possible the utilization of our links. When you share them, as long as you share them in some encrypted manner, such as WhatsApp or Signal, once the people are following those links, there's very little that the government can do to track them back. Also, the links die very quickly. Right now, we have them set to die after 2 weeks, but we can manipulate that. And if somebody told us, look, we'd be using this, but we need the links to die after a day or an hour, we can adjust it to do that for either specific publications or specific regions. We have control over all of that. So, so we're very, very motivated to try to make this as safe as possible. And to the extent to which we have thought of everything we've thought of, we do that. Obviously, we think of new things all the time. Michael and I have very creative heads on our shoulders, and we constantly come up with new ways to both go around the various blockades and also invent new mechanisms that are more and more effective in distributing information.
Could you speak a bit about the difficulties you encounter in your work and how you manage to bypass internet blocking?
The biggest difficulty we've encountered in our work at the moment is that we haven't found investors, and we haven't, and all of the foundations and funds that we've approached have found ways to either tell us that we could get money within a year or two, or that we don't line up with their various congressional mandates. So at the moment, our biggest problem is that we need to scale horizontally. Now, what that means is, like, we have, I think, 8 servers, and we need 80 because we have something in the neighborhood of 50 million people who are waiting to use this platform. They don't know they're waiting to use it, but they are. And because they are the existing audiences of Medusa and Doors and Echo and Mediazona and Varlamov, and on and on and on. These audiences are currently using these various media in one way or another. And these media are working with us, and they would love to tell their audiences to come use us. And I'm asking them not to, because if they did right now, we would fall over. We just don't have the horizontal bandwidth to handle all of this traffic. So our biggest problem right now is, in fact, financing. If we had the money to spin up this horizontal scaling, then we could really, pull out all the stops and let the traffic flow. I would say that has been the biggest difficulty, because in the converse, the kind of accolade and the kind of support we get, non-financial, from across the media sphere, from the government, from various pro-democratic organizations, from all sorts of, I could start listing names and we'd be here for another 15 minutes. It's been really overwhelming. I was invited to speak at Davos just last week. As I said, I was in Berlin speaking both for the German Council of Foreign Relations and at GlobeSec. It's like people really want this to work. And when they find out about it, they're very excited about it, but we need money. So that's our principal concern.
Makes sense. Thank you. Can you recall and describe a crazy example of Russian propaganda that stood out to you? One of the audience members was curious.
Oh my God. There's so many, it's hard to pick. I think that the kinds of stuff that came out around Bucha was probably the most distressing, because Bucha was a news that hit the Russian media sphere hard. It penetrated. And so the Russians had no choice but to deal with the fact that this news was arriving, right? It was a tsunami. And so they started crafting the most inane and bizarre excuses about deep fakes and all sorts. It was just, it was a natural reaction where they couldn't say, we're not seeing this. So they had to invent some rationalization for why they were seeing it. And then the kinds of explanations for what they were seeing really ran the gamut to all sorts of absolute inanity. That's the thing that stands out the most, but it's a daily thing. On a daily basis, there will be multiple calls to start a nuclear war, to not start a nuclear war, to threaten a nuclear war, the propaganda machinery is in some state of panic as well, because the propagandists understand that they have probably chosen the wrong horse. Right. And there's no question these people who are at the heart of the propaganda don't believe what they're saying. They clearly do not. Right. They are obviously mouthpieces for a government that has run them into a very, very deep ditch. It's just that at this point, they have no choice but to keep digging. But so the kinds of things they say are really profoundly inane. And if you want a dose of it, you just have to tune into Channel 1 any day, and it's all there.
It's great advice. How can journalism be a tool to achieve the sustainable development goals in these tumultuous times?
I think, as I said, journalism is at the heart of all positive growth for humanity, right? I have this Yoda-style transitive property, which is that information leads to understanding, and understanding leads to compassion, and compassion leads to human flourishing. Right? It's a direct line. So the thing is, people want what's best, all of them, right? The Russians too. They want what's best. They want their children to be healthy and successful and educated and prosperous. And they want to have the ability to live a life free from fear and anxiety and terror. And as a civilization, we've been moving in that direction, certainly at the cost of certain things like the environment. So journalism, as long as it doesn't play into the hysteria narrative, right? Because people do get exhausted by hysteria and eventually just shut down. Many studies have shown this. So as long as journalism just exposes what's real and lets people interface with their reality and gives people the information they need in order to connect to their various leaderships and to either change those leaderships or convince them to do whatever it is that they desire, journalism is that conduit, right? Because otherwise people are just living in ignorance and then they believe whatever snippets of whatever comes their way. So I think that, again, journalism is intrinsically critical to bringing about all positive change, because journalism is that information conduit which leads to human flourishing, if you follow my transitive Yoda style example.
In your opinion, how much of Putin's propaganda really exists in the world's leading media, not just specific to Russia, but in channels across the world?
It exists all over, and it exists in a range, right? It's very rare to find the level of propaganda which dismisses out of hand things like Bucha, right? Like that's not common, and people understand. Most people outside of Russia understand that Bucha happened, and they get the broad strokes of what it was. So the kind of Putin propaganda that we see that is more pervasive and more effective is the kind that explains away why what's happening is happening and provides unjustified but plausible sounding alternatives to what the reality is. So you have Putin's sort of alternate history about the nature of Ukraine and how they belonged to Russia or are part of Russia or whatever he's been spewing in that regard, or his dismissal of the fact that they have an actual border which he somehow feels he has the right to cross. Now, there's ways to formulate that sound very reasonable, and he does, and then a lot of media picks up on this. And then people say things like, well, the war was not unprovoked. For example, Roger Waters, right? And I'm a fan. I love Pink Floyd. I love Raj. But he was speaking to the UN, I believe, and he kind of threw in, but the war was not unprovoked. And he didn't elaborate, but it's a nonsense proposition. You can't provoke a war. I mean, that's just not the way things work. And so those words were put in his mouth by Putin one way or another, right? By some long channel of dilution and stirring and shaking. That kind of propaganda is everywhere.
How can Ukrainians living abroad help fight Putin's propaganda in the world?
So I think the key here is, again, it's this mobilization where the information's out there and it's on all these people to actually send it and discuss it with their friends and family. So as an example, we took in a Ukrainian family about a year ago. The woman is from Kharkov, and her mother and siblings both live in Moscow. And so this woman now lives with us in Canada. Unfortunately, her mother passed away, but she is in daily contact with her siblings, and her siblings are completely enamored of the lie. When she was fleeing from Kharkov, her siblings were insisting to her that these are the Ukrainians that are bombing themselves and that she's actually fleeing from the Ukrainians and Russia has nothing to do with this. So this, so again, this is an anecdote, but it's a very personal anecdote where this person is trying to somehow get these people living in Moscow to understand what the reality is. And so our platform makes it possible for her to send these people links that they can then follow and look at, and then they can have a conversation about it. And that's essentially what everyone needs to be doing, is they have all, Ukrainians are in fact very tightly integrated with the Russian population. They have siblings and friends and family back and forth all over the place. There's tons of Russians living in Ukraine. There's tons of Ukrainians living in Russia. And they just need to talk, and hopefully we can provide them with the facility to have those conversations.
At what age did you start pursuing your passions and interests in your career, and what challenges did you face, or maybe steps that led you to start an anti-censorship media outlet?
Oh my God. So again, it's a very long journey. My passions included being a musician and a comedian, eventually a programmer. My programming began at CBS News, which is where I first got my taste of journalism. And this project is not so much a passion project. It's a, if nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to have to project. And when I first started and I approached the people who were going to help me get the word out there that this was happening, including Bill Kristol and Jeffrey Gedman, formerly of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and originally Walsh, and RDI, which is Gary Kasparov's organization. Like, all these people said to me, this sounds fantastic, but this must exist already, right? Like, this has to exist. There's no way that you're inventing this bicycle. And then it turned out it didn't exist, right? So the notion of, well, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to have to, was the passion, because I felt that I had to do something. And there are many situations where everybody wants to do something, but they really have nothing they can do other than maybe send some money or spread the word or something like that. But in this case, I was very weirdly positioned at the epicenter of all of these enterprises that gave me the kind of unique ability to both build this and get the word out there that it was happening. So, the age was 51. If the question is what age I was, that's what it was.
Thanks for sharing. What are your thoughts on the future of media in the face of increasing challenges related to censorship and disinformation?
I have nothing but positive and optimistic outlooks on this across the board. I think that the fact that we launched what we launched is a testament to the fact that where there's a vacuum, something will come and fill it. And I'm sure that if I didn't do this, eventually somebody else would have. And the nature of the technology behind all of this is such that it's kind of unstoppable. And the world wants to be able to be free to read what it wants to read, see what it wants to see, sing the songs it wants to sing, et cetera, et cetera. That's the nature of humanity. Like we're a very aspirational creature, and we wish to be free. So there's no stopping that aspect. And in terms of the way that it's developing in the modern media sphere in the West, there's already tons of things that are rising up to counteract the Facebooks and the. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm picking on anybody, right? You know, I don't want to pick on Facebook. They're a baby in their crib. So there are alternatives that are up and coming that address the kinds of problems that entities like Facebook have introduced over the last 20 years. And maybe Facebook itself will shift and pivot and do something benevolent and useful, as opposed to just being a thorn in everybody's side. But if not, then they will be replaced. And the West wants to be informed. They don't want to be pitted against each other. Nobody does. People don't like this narrative of we all hate each other, and they know it's false. We don't hate each other. We have minor differences that are all totally addressable. So I'm very optimistic.
Thank you. And what role do you believe platforms like yours will play in shaping this future?
Well, I believe my platform will play a role in shaping this future. I'm somebody who has the beliefs that I have voiced over the last hour or so, and I wish to help the world aspire to greatness and compassion and mutual help and love, because that's what I feel. It's onwards and upwards. That's my feeling.
Thank you. I think we've concluded questions from the audience. Dr. Durbach, do you have any questions for our speaker?
Well, actually, not so much questions. I would just say that, unfortunately, ignorance is bliss, and it takes a lot of courage to become fearless and not be afraid of communicating the truth. Which started after Chernobyl. And I started it because I was very, very upset about the lies that were going around at that time. So I decided I'm going to try to start an organization that is going to focus on distributing facts, scientific facts, and scientific truth. And I have not stopped since then. And I definitely wish you a tremendous amount of luck and success in order to achieve your goals.
Well,
and
thank you so much for having me in this wonderful platform and exposing our project to all of your viewers.
You're most welcome. And Susie, thank you very much for moderating. And I wish you a very good and healthy week. Goodbye.